Joining us now to talk more about Zimbabwe's political landscape and the court judgment, we are joined by Emeritus Professor of UNISA, Shadrack Gutto. Prof, thank you so much for joining us on The Globe. Now, a victory for ZANU-PF, and many analysts have speculated that this was a litmus test for the judiciary. What's your take on this?
I think it is both political and legal. First of all, one has to say that Chamisa claimed victory before the Electoral Commission announced the results. And that puts a lot of temperature into the whole situation where there was a claim political parties should never announce election results before the electoral body. So that was a problem. And secondly, I think that according to the ruling today of the Constitutional Court, Chief Justice Malaba was quite correct in focusing on what is the evidence which is being brought to the court to support the idea. One of it, I think, in my view, it has not been really brought out properly, is that you can't have the ruling party, ZANU-PF, winning constituencies and losing the presidency. I think that there's something which has not been discussed so far, because people vote for the presidency and the constituency. And to say that in the presidency they vote different from how they vote in the constituencies, I think doesn't make sense to me. Thirdly, I think the idea which came out in the court about evidence is important. Law is applied to facts, and the facts is the evidence. And without evidence, you cannot say the law goes this way or that way. What is the fact? And that is the evidential part of what ought to have come out. And that was not focused on properly. And I think that that's where we are. So I agree with the Court of Appeal.
Yes. Now, Prof, in terms of the evidence, let's just speak very briefly, let's touch very briefly on that. Why was the MDC not able to provide tangible evidence?
Because MDC had already announced that Chamisa was already the president. So they didn't pay attention to how they were going to prove that in a court of law. And I think it was a presumption rather than reality. And they thought that by making that pronouncement, it was going to be accepted by the court. No, they had to actually provide actual evidence, and that was not there, or did not come out in the court proceedings. And I think that's where the problem really lies.
Now, Prof, we saw a tweet by President-elect Emmerson Mnangagwa, and his appeal for peace in the country, and reiterated his willingness to work with the opposition MDC as Nelson Chamisa and his executives. Now, is Zimbabwe ready for that, for a coalition government? Is the MDC ready for a coalition government? Are we likely to see that taking place?
I think any country ought to consider where there are really contested elections, or where they want to bring people together, coming from where Zimbabwe has been, which has been very divided over a long period of time politically, that coalition governments ought to be entrenched in African governments, not just in Zimbabwe. I think there are many countries where to be able to invite those who have not won elections to be part of governing. They are not going to be the leaders of the, head of state or whatever, and so on, but to give them a role in governing the country is important, because what we want is peace and governance so that we move forward rather than winner takes all approach that we have been using on the continent. There are many parts of the world that engage in coalition governments. It is not just in trying to apply to Zimbabwe and so on. I lived for 5 years in Sweden, and they are used to that, and it's normal, and so on. And you bring people together, and they govern together, and people move forward. There's a winner, and then the others are brought in order to govern the country. So that's what we need, the country to be cohesive, to move forward together, and not this idea of winner take all.
Speaking of the idea of winner takes all, at this point in time, can we say that Zimbabwe has a strong opposition going into the future, bearing in mind the numbers that have increased in terms of the voters for the MDC? They've got the youth vote and, so on. Are we likely to see a strong opposition and that winner take all attitude changed?
Yeah, it needs to change, even though the MDC got the youth vote and everything, and it's a strong opposition at this particular point. The president only got 50 point something. That means that the rest voted for the opposition coalition, even the opposition is not a one-party opposition. It is part of a coalition of many political parties. And therefore, as we move forward, ZANU-PF, as we move forward, probably we lose winning elections, but it needs to be brought in a way that does not destabilize the country. So I think that Zimbabwean ought to think that way rather than
thinking of the negative.
It is a winner and a loser. This idea that the opposition and our use of the term opposition parties is also wrong. We need to craft a language that indicates that even if you lose, you are not just opposition, because first of all, you are in parliament. You are part of the lawmaking process in the country. So you are also part of governing the country. And I think that's part of the problem. We have borrowed languages or terminologies that do not help people to see that even after you have lost, you are still part of government.
Very quickly, just in wrapping up, Prof, the court case, will the results legitimize President-elect Emmerson Mnangagwa's presidency with regards to the people of Zimbabwe? Are they going to accept this going forward?
They can't help if they want to go with the rule of law, constitutional or constitutionalism. They have to accept it. We have lost, and therefore let us move forward, but see how the country is going to be governed, and let us focus on the next elections as they come, and so on. But the electoral management body ought to be also scrutinized to ensure that people have confidence in whatever it is.
Prof, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.